Greetings, fellow historians. Welcome to another AP World History Recap. Today's topic is the Middle East. So to begin this episode, let's start with everyone's favorite part of every learning process, vocabulary. The Webster's American Dictionary defines... Yeah, don't worry, I'm not doing that anymore. That's awful. Okay, what will happen out of Mesopotamia, meaning the land between two rivers, will be one example of a pattern throughout history. While there will be a core center of human development, there will be groups on the outside. So they will develop something new that will allow them to overtake the core, and for as long as they can, until they become settled and now part of the core, do they get conquered themselves. It's a pattern of core and periphery empires. And the periphery will find some new way to take over the core. And it happens repeatedly. So let's start the story between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The first city-states began in that region about 4,000 years ago, headed by a king that was supported by a religion as a god or the god's representative, that they enjoyed state cohesion or solidarity, as they were all the same people. You had the same people with the same language that all looked alike, acted alike, customs alike. So they all had their own god to their own city. And so their god protected their city. They all recognized different gods, but their city had their god. For example, anyone living in the city of knew that they were the same group of Ursians? No. Urix? No. Herbivores. Nope, no, that was terrible. Okay, let me look at this up. Sumerians. Yeah, they're all called Sumerians. So, very close. Stupid writer. Anyway, there was a sense of civic pride belonging to your city. And so with that came the acceptance of the rule of law, trade customs, currency, religion, all these things that go into a modern state. Now, 4,000 years ago, this lasts for about 1,500 years, where the highest organization of any civilization is a city-state and their surrounding areas, a centered polis or city-state area, and then the farmlands and fields and crops and everything else. People did trade, but that wasn't the big thing. It was self-sufficiency on their own scale. The thing was, they weren't empires. And this is where we get into definitions. See, an empire is a group or any group of states or nations under one supreme authority. So an empire controls land that is outside its own state. The United States is actually an empire. We have American Samoa, we have Puerto Rico that is technically not one of the states. So that's what we mean by empire. It's not just simply controlling some other people that don't look like the original people or the core of the civilization. It's do you own land that is not considered part of your empire or part of your core empire or rule.
Get on with it. Yes, get on with it.
Early on, these early empires conquered new land, but the places they conquered were part now of their realm. And so they were not a distinct district or province or territory. They were now part of the realm of that city-state and turning into a broad sense of an empire. So this happened in Mesopotamia for a while. Then came the Persians. Now, the Persians have about 3 different pre-Islamic empires that have different names for them. The first one is called the Achaemenid Persians, or the Achaemenid Empire. And that's, for some of you, that's the one in 300. But 300 and the Greeks and all of that, they present a different story of what they actually were. When we look at the Persians, seen as the bad guys of the Greeks, but let's burst that bubble for a second. Let's look at what the Persians were versus what the Greeks were. The Persian Empire of this era began as a new development in statecraft, and what they did was they had a king of kings, and that was their emperor. He was considered the king of kings, but beneath him were called satraps or governors, and they ruled the provinces all around. So if they conquered a new area like Babylon or Judea, they instilled a governor who usually was of the people themselves, to rule. And so what happened was you had people being ruled by their own people, with protection from a greater power, a supreme authority. Now let's look at the level of success of this new idea. So first, that old pattern of the fringe to conquer the core. Mesopotamia was the first core of development, and a new idea, bureaucratic administration, allowed the Persians in present-day Iran, so just to the east of Mesopotamia, to eventually conquer over Mesopotamia and go further into the Levant, which is Eastern Mediterranean, and then all the way into Egypt. Good to know that one too. So they could effectively administer a new area with lower costs because they had their own people ruling over the larger scale, but at the local scale, you still had the same customs and less resistance. So all they would have to get in return then was support of the supreme authority, usually in taxation as well as military. So their growing power threatened the new Babylonian Empire and conquered them pretty quickly. The Persians spent money on roads connecting their empire over long distances, seeing that infrastructure allowed further trade and communication. Most of the projects states build when they build roads are for effective communication, because you have to understand the level of speed we have now we take for granted. You all get annoyed when you're streaming delays or there's a hiccup in a Netflix, like, oh, I can't, why do I even have this anymore? We ignore the fact that, I know, here you go, I'm old. When I was born, the fastest way to communicate, if it wasn't by telephone, was a letter in the mail that would take 2 to 3 days, even if it was local. Cross distances, 5 or 6 days, and I know, I'm old, right, I get it. But the level of communication with that level of writing or information doesn't change until about 25 or 30 years ago with email. Before that, it was always handing messages along. In some cases, the Persian Empire was considered the first of the second wave empires, and this is going to last from about 600 to 600, the second wave of understanding how to administer large areas. The Greeks will eventually do this, and then the Romans will eventually in the Mediterranean, but the Mediterranean world and Europe get their own video, so we're not going to spend too much there. So, back to when we consider the Persians the bad guys in Western history. Well, we have been taught that the Greeks were the defenders of representative government, defeating 2 Persian invasions and keeping Europe on its own path. Yay, win, right? Well, let's look at it from a different perspective. The Persian army was a 100,000 man strong force with troops from Egypt to Afghanistan, Arabs in the south and Caucasian mountain peoples to the north. So they had a wide range of people with a lot of different skills. They allowed self-rule and demanded tribute. The emperor, once again the king of kings, was called that so that the regions or satraps could be kings themselves. So other places could still call themselves king. They did not have slaves. They never imposed their religion, Zoroastrianism, on anyone else. They did want to conquer the Greeks and add them to their empire, but all they asked was just tribute. And the Greeks, of course, were saying, no way, this is tyranny, this is seizing power by force, which it was. I'm not saying like the Greeks had no right, like they were defending themselves, right? But we're going to understand, when we talk about Greek democracy, Athenians, only 10 to 20% of the population could vote because it had to be wealthy males. And they owned slaves, by the way. So let's make that clear. Sparta didn't have anything. They just basically had a very strong military to prevent slave revolts from their own, slaves, or helots is what they were called. We're going to fast forward a bit. While there were more empires after the Achaemenid, the Parthian, Seleucid empires, they don't really have that major impact on world history for the scope of this course and this video. So we're going to keep going further on. While the Persians effectively overthrew the Mesopotamians, they too were overtaken by a fringe empire of a fringe empire. And what I mean by that is the Persians attacked the Greeks to add them to their empire and failed. And it wasn't the Greeks that actually overthrew them, but the Macedonians. And the Macedonians were a fringe, or like a hillbilly hill people of the Greeks. Like the Greeks looked down on the Macedonians for being, the out there folks. But then another fringe or colony from the Greeks come out, And it's the Romans that will control this region, particularly the Eastern Mediterranean and Egypt as well. And we're not going to focus on them yet. I can't wait till next video. Because there's going to be another video on them. So we're just going to fast forward to after the Romans, to about 500 years CE. So around the late 500s, early 600s, we have the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, and the Sassanids, which are the last pre-Islamic empire in Persia, feuding back and forth over the regions that they have in the middle. So Mesopotamia, the Levant, parts of Arabia. But in that region, those clashes, what we're going to have is not just a new empire emerge, but a new religion that is much more inclusive to all of those people and draws on some of the same notions as both of those. And so people are going to be attracted to it and spread. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so let's keep going. In the trade routes along the Red Sea, Christians, Jews, including many Jewish communities that were exiled, Zoroastrians, and pagan faiths were all intermingled. They all traded with one another and got along. In that area, too, a trader, nephew to the curator of the Kaaba. The Kaaba was this black shrine and a holy place for religions. Like they believed that it had some connection to the gods, and so anyone could come there and pay their respects at this time. This nephew of the curator claimed to have a revelation from the angel Gabriel, and he was a messenger of the Judeo-Christian god Yahweh. His uncle, worried about lost prophets from the pagan shrine that he curated, distanced and then expelled his nephew, named Muhammad. Muhammad married a wealthy merchant who's wealthy in her own right and was instrumental in supporting his meditations and understanding. She also believed in his meditation and became the first person to submit to the word of God, Allah in Arabic, and so became the first Muslim. Islam itself means submission, and is submitting themselves before God. So, a quick side note, and this isn't going to be as quick, because of one of my issues is to at least help teach understanding of other religions and how interpretations can change or how we view things. There are many misconceptions about any religion, and so you can look at the sacred texts of most religions and find things that aren't part of the Orthodox faith of what it is today. And I only usually mean the ones that have chronicles and whatnot, not ones that have life teachings. So the Quran, in this case, is composed of what are called surahs, or chapters, and they're organized roughly based on the length of each surah. So the longest ones are first. There's no thematic or chronological structure. However, there are other holy books that add to the Muslim understanding of their faith. One of them is called the Hadith, or the sayings of Muhammad. Now, about each, the Quran was not finalized until after the death of Muhammad, so they are based on what he taught. The Hadith are the sayings of Muhammad. They are believed to be any phrase someone has heard Muhammad say added together to help with the understandings of what are in the surah of the Quran. So, additionally, there are surah, and there are as well hadith that contradict or conflict with the messages. So what Islam has done, and the Orthodox practices in most of these faiths, is decided on what is the best interpretation of them, or others can be open to that interpretation. That's all fine. Now, before you think that, oh my gosh, I can't believe they're contradicting themselves, the Judeo-Christian traditions and the Bible itself has contradictions in it too. Not trying to get you all defensive, and we're not trying to go down that road, and we're not going to say, look at that. We're just saying, for now, that there are problems in any of these sacred texts. And I'm going to get to one example in a second. The problem with the Hadith, though, is that anything could be included if they could prove a connection to Muhammad, and Muhammad said it. So, while fewer were added to the Hadith as time went on, they also became a bit more out there in terms of canon or orthodox. Some leaders would add them, saying they can claim a connection to Muhammad so that it further supports what they're trying to do right now. And to give you a better example of a modern, let's say, example, George Washington wrote what he called the rules of civility, and some of those things are still in American tradition today. Now, he wrote that during his life and posted it and stuff. But let's pretend, for this argument, that the rules of civility were a collection of sayings from George Washington that guide all Americans on how they should be. Now, me, just a teacher out here, you know what? Let's say I've had a family phrase or something where I should be a teacher. I'm the first teacher in my family, by the way, so I don't have any long line of teachers. But let's just say I've had this phrase in my family for a long time, or I made it up. We're not going to get into that right now. That's not the point. But let's just say I want teachers are the deliverers of virtue, morality, and should be revered in their skill and knowledge. Look to them for answers and guidance, and pay them handsomely. Let's say all of that is exactly what George Washington said, according to my family tradition. Or not, and I just want to add it. Whatever one. It doesn't matter. Now, to verify that, someone would have to say, well, how do you know George Washington could have said that? I said, okay, well, thanks to my dad's Ancestry.com entries and all this fun stuff, my father's uncle was Lieutenant Colonel Richard Taylor, father of President Zachary Taylor, who commanded a Virginia regiment in the Continental Army during the American Revolution. Now, it's entirely probable that a commander of a Virginia regiment knew George Washington. In case you didn't know, he came from Virginia. So there's easily a connection there that they could have met. They could have been around. And Colonel Richard Taylor could have remembered that phrase and said, we got to recognize teachers. So I've proven there's a possible connection to George Washington. Now, because of that proof, it could be added to the rules of civility. And now, boom, we got another phrase to add. So here's why I bring all of this up. There are parts of the Hadith that are not followed by Muslims today. And there's parts of the Quran that are not followed by Muslims today because they don't fit the general idea of what the religion is meant to be in terms of their interpretation. And why I'm going through all of this is that there's similar things within the Christian Bible or the Jewish Torah and its teachings that have that too. So it's not just Islam has this. These Western faiths all have something in there. In Jewish tradition, Daniel has some prophecies, and those prophecies all come true up until about 620 or 630 BCE. Then they're all wrong. All of them. I mean, you got accurate, gone. And what's going on there? Well, we dated it. That's exactly how we know how old that book is, because all the prophecies didn't come true. So how do you establish a line that makes sense? You have all these truthful prophecies and then future ones, and you claim the book is something that it's not, that this is revelation that we've received. You want to look at other ugly things? You have Joshua in the Battle of Jericho. For those of you VeggieTales, it's Josh in the big wall. But in the end, the walls of Jericho come down and they slaughter everybody in Jericho. So by slaughter, we might actually use the term genocide in today's standards. So what I am saying is, in these traditions, there's a lot of stuff in all of these texts that we don't follow. And just because they're there doesn't necessarily mean that everyone who believes in that religion follows what's in that, even if it's in their holy book. That would be like a Buddhist going out and saying, oh, Mr. Johnson is Christian, therefore he probably wants to sell his daughters into slavery, because that's in there. That's perfectly legit. So that's what we do when we have to take care of religion. We have to look at what the practices are, even if their holy books have content in there. Because, as you can see, if you judge them by just what you read and not looking into how it's practiced, you're not being really fair to any faith. So the last part of this that I want to get through about religion and governance and empire is that the empires that have a faith, that they use their faith to unite their empire, isn't really an example of the teachings of that faith. So when we talk about empires and their religions, we got to isolate that they use their religion. That doesn't mean they reflect all of its values. So eventually Muhammad would take over Mecca, and he was already allied and supported by Medina, and he would move outward from the Arabian Peninsula. Though dying in 632, his empire would quadruple by the end of the 4 rightly guided caliphs. They were 4 leaders of the Islam empire, encompassing the entire Arabian Peninsula into Egypt, the Levant, which is the Eastern Mediterranean, and Mesopotamia. Here again, a fringe region develops something new to unify and rule people, and is able to challenge existing empires. And in this case, it's a new religion with a clear method towards salvation. But more importantly, was that it was generally tolerant of people of the book, Christians and Jews, and started out being tolerant of Zoroastrians in Persia. Side note on all of that. Religions in the pre-Reformation period. Without exactly fixing a date, religion in the ancient and medieval world was much more seen as state than personal identity. As armies conquered regions and brought them under control, the state religion would be instituted. New temples or churches or whatever that religion was would be erected, and the new state religion of that region now needs to adhere. So, at the rise of the Muslim Empire or the Arab Empire, the conquered people were given choices of conversion or paying taxes called the jizya. While Christians and Jews would not be enslaved by Muslims, they could be enslaved by others and purchased, but they were automatically granted freedom if they converted to Islam, because Islam means submission to God, and you do not submit to any other person if you're a Muslim, only to God. So that's a little side note of how religions were in this time period. So the Arab Empire grew and expanded with the relative tolerance of non-Muslims and quick adaptation with their conquered peoples. The first empire flourished under the first caliphate, called the Umayyad dynasty. Dynasty being a group or family rule. A caliphate was ruled by Islam as the successors to Muhammad and his empire. So the Umayyads, they centered in Damascus and extended their empire from Spain to the edges of Iran at its greatest extent in a single empire. However, because of its preference for Arabs in control of their government and rule, it brought about a revolution of the non-Arab peoples. And the Abbasid Caliphate comes out of that, bringing in the cultural tolerance that began the golden age of the Muslim world. 2 Muslim cities grew and expanded to be the greatest of the cities of the world in their time, Cordoba and Baghdad. Big deal time. Something to remember for the year. If you look at this map, wait, that was a Mercator map. This is 2020. Good thing I have a fixer for this.
Lord Vader.
You have failed me for the last time, Admiral.
Right. Regional maps. What do you mean lost? What do you mean you lost it?
I shall assume full responsibility for losing them and apologize to Lord Vader.
Apology accepted.
Okay. No more of that. A map of the cities in their regions. Good. They are at a confluence of 2 or more cultures. Just act normal. When cultures mix, they create new developments and innovations. They are able to blend or merge these ideas, giving us such things as canons, the heliocentric theory, even American Chinese food, right? Good stuff. And German chocolate cake, which was created in Texas. Cordoba, in Al-Andalus, which is Muslim Spain, was at the crossroads of Christian Europe and Muslim North Africa. From here, the first university is established, and at one point was the largest city in the world. Spain also becomes a major melting pot and relatively tolerant. Look at this picture of two women playing chess. Okay, this tells us so much about society of the time. First, chess is an intelligent board game and widely popular. And how do we know it's widely popular? One, we have lots of images of people playing chess. And second, in this case, women are playing it. Now, yes, I know that sounds awful and generally don't record personalized views or personified views of this time. I'm a feminist. I've studied women in Western culture and patriarchy. Proud feminist here. But I think this needs to be shown how this painting tells us so much about society at this time. In this time period, while women were given some rights, like land ownership, they could bear witness in court, lower than a man's, but it's still bear witness. And they can get some education, they still needed a male escort in public. They were also some form of veil, if they were upper classes, to shield the outside world. We're talking Byzantine women as well as Muslim women. So here, two women are actually playing chess, and they're not family. How do we know they're not family, or could be different peoples? Well, one's a Muslim, and the other's Christian. As we look at society and culture, treatment of women is as cultural as food, language, rituals, and traditions. And so with these cultures, go with it that they are not only able to associate with one another, but they were able to play chess, play recreation together, that it didn't matter that they were of a different faith, that you could not associate. That's a big deal to show you just how permissive this society was of other people's faiths. Now, Baghdad too becomes a major center of cultural trade and learning. Capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, and we'll go, spoilers alert, until 1258 CE with the Mongol invasion. Here, Persian, Arab, Greek, and Christian learning all came together to produce all sorts of new ideas and innovations. The astrolabe, a tool used for calculating latitude, elevation, and various positions of stars, was invented, and developments of mathematics, cartography, medicine, and anatomy. Literature, such as the 1001 Arabian Nights and the Legend of Sinbad, were created out of this time. And other things allotted, and it was also the center of a massive trade networks, and the region flourished. Caravanserai, which basically are motels for people on horses, were created along major trade routes, notably the Silk Road. At this time period, the majority of trade throughout the world was going on in the Indian Ocean. It did increase traffic and profit going along these land routes. So, the big picture. Being able to draw on other cultures is always a boon to new developments. That's going to be something to understand. Bringing in new ideas from somewhere outside where it's standard will generate new ideas in learning. So, multiple cultures mixing, good times. Having women included in predominantly male professions, you're going to get new perspectives. If you don't believe me, play some computer games. A lot of story-driven games nowadays are written with women writing, and they're good. So just keeping in mind, a lot of these things, merging multiple different viewpoints is actually beneficial for everyone. I use development in this language because it is a good AP word for thing. So whenever I say something like developments, it could mean anything that advances society. Transportation methods, medicines, army tactics, fashion, religions, and a host of other things. So that's what I mean by development, and that's something you need to know throughout the year. Development's a big deal. Now, the blending of cultures has two responses. First is new developments. The second is resistance, and that's a problem. Many cultures do not want change, and the response can turn violent, either discrimination, attacks, civil war, exile, or genocide. That is one of two major lessons from history we should heed. That would be the benefit of the mixing of culture and ideas. Second one to learn is that the center of development does not stay the center. The ancient world had city-states forming a kingdom to be invaded by a tolerant multinational empire, to then be conquered by another outside region. They, the Greek successor states that come about, too, fell from a fringe empire in the Romans, from the central Mediterranean. They fell in power and prestige in the West by barbarian invasions, while the East deteriorated with the rise of the Muslim Empire. They will fall to the Mongols' empire, and history shows us that the top does not always stay on top unless they are vigilant against all threats, internal and external, but also pushing forward. So, that's the Middle East for now. We'll talk more later. Thanks for watching.
Even the babies are one of the most dangerous animals in the world, so I built this cage to keep them secure so there's no possible, oh my god.